Okay, so wrapping up part two, talking about mechanisms of evolution, examples of direct observations. Hopefully this cements in that natural selection isn't, or any mechanism of evolution isn't about making perfect organisms. It's about selection acting on existing variations, and it's based on both random and non-random events. So we talked about this example of this frog here that's able to make a song that attracts mates, but it unfortunately also attracts predators. So lots of examples of imperfect adaptations that work in many cases but don't always work for organisms. We then spent the rest of our evolution unit just talking about major misconceptions about evolution, so you should be able to go through each of these, maybe even pause the video, go through each one, talk about why it's a misconception, and what's an example to support why it's a misconception. We spent a good amount of time talking about this last one specifically, that evolution says people came from modern chimps and monkeys, and look back at some phylogenetic trees and some fossil evidence of different hominids that are related to humans that don't necessarily imply that we came from all of these humans, these other human-like primates, all these other hominids, but that we share a close evolutionary relationship to them in that they are our cousins. And who our direct ancestors are, our most recent ancestor, is still out for debate a little bit. Again, there's evidence that that we have a very close relationship to Homo erectus, and that we've done some mating with Homo neanderthalensis, but who exactly it was is still out for jury to decide. For more evidence to come. Where did diversity come from? So we talked about the major topics of speciation and origins of life on Earth. So speciation, we talked about the difference between allopatric, which is speciation that occurs when there's some sort of physical barrier, or sympatric when there's some non-physical barrier. We also talked about the maggot fly case study as an investigation into how new species come about and how we can utilize species concepts to evaluate speciation, whether speciation has occurred or not. So if you pause for a moment, you might want to remember what those species concepts are and how would you explain them to somebody. So here are the four. So go through and make sure you can describe each of those. Speciation is all about reproductive isolation. So there has to be some sort of barrier, some sort of reproductive barrier. So here we see this population of these weird critters. There's a reproductive barrier. Time passes, and this population begins interbreeding separately from this population. And over time, what we're going to see is that, you know, just like in any case, random mutations pop up in both populations, and we focus on this one, this white nose over here, and we track it and see what happens. Well, since it's arisen in this population and not in the other, we can expect that over time, potentially if there's some selective advantage, then that mutation is going to spread through the population, and we're going to see after many generations that this subpopulation is going to start looking pretty different from this subpopulation. It all started with this reproductive barrier. Do we have two separate species here? Well, going back to these four species concepts would be a good way to kind of evaluate that question. Origins of life on Earth, we talked about the four-stage hypothesis of the formation of the first cells, so small organic compounds to large organic molecules to early cells to some capacity to replicate your genetic material. And so all of those things were necessary in order for the molecular stage to be set for the first life, right? The first replicating life. And from there, once we got the first life, then we were able to explode in diversity after that, but it was a long process. So that process, you know, can be tracked from 3.9 billion years ago to about 500 million years ago. So we see that these are the kind of 5 major events associated with the movement from the first cells to the explosion of species on Earth. We talked about each of these and talked about some research that supports, you know, the ordering of these things. We also talked about the research that supports the ordering of these. So definitely go back over that research, look at that origins video that we watched a snippet of to kind of clarify those details. Final chunk of the study guide has to do with unity and diversity across protists, fungi, and plants. So for each of these groups, you want to think about, okay, they're members of domain eukarya, but really what sets them apart from the other groups? So we know protists are really just anything that's not classified as a fungus, animal, or plant. And so protists are, but still eukaryotic, so protists obviously are going to be really diverse. There's some unicellular, some multicellular. They're called paraphyletic because they fall on multiple branches of this tree of life, not sister taxa per se, but kind of far apart from each other, which supports that they are what's called paraphyletic. Monophyletic would mean occupying like one major branch of a tree, like over here. But since we find them dispersed across this tree of life, we call them paraphyletic. So have some examples of protists and know the defining characteristics of them. Same for fungi. So one defining characteristic would be heterotrophic. So try to think of some others. And then finally for plants, plants have cell walls made of cellulose, but what are some of the other defining characteristics of plants, right? Waxy cuticle, alternation of generations. These are some of the defining features that we talked about. We discussed how algae, some algae are considered plants, but most algae are not considered plants. We kind of looked through the evidence around brown algae, red algae, and green algae in terms of structure, reproduction, and other interesting info to look for relationships among those and plants to allow us to think about what has the closest evolutionary relationship. Green algae definitely have the closest relationship, but knowing why that is and why some green algae are even considered plants is definitely worth looking back at your notes on, or the notes that are in the notes discussion forum. Great. And then we finished up by talking about different groups of plants. So we kind of went over this diagram and did a lot of field exploration, plant walks, and exploration in lab of all of these different groups. So knowing kind of their major features and what unifies them, what makes them diverse, and overall what really unifies like all of these groups in eukarya, and again what makes them diverse. These are some practice plant questions that are at the end of the plant slide set that I'd highly recommend practicing. And looking back at the study guide, again focusing on how form dictates function, how structure relates to function, and then how studying the forms and functions of these three groups allows us to visualize the concept of unity and diversity. So I wish you the best of luck on your exam. I'll be thinking about you guys, and hope it goes really well. And don't forget to take a deep breath and, shift around if you need to. And remember that you're doing your best, and this exam is not going to determine the fate of your life. And, try to exhibit all those habits of mind that we've talked about, like having a sense of humor when you feel yourself getting anxious, just doing some self-talk about growth mindset, and reminding yourself that, again, you're doing your best, and that this is just an opportunity to grow. All right, I'm off.